Hey folks, tonight we're not kicking off with some philosopher, emperor, or forgotten queen. Nope, we're starting with a road, a nasty, dusty, sometimes deadly road stretching over 2,000 miles through America's wild frontier. This road lured pioneers westward with promises of land and glory, but really delivered descent, starvation, and broken wagon wheels. So, before you get comfy, take a sec to like the video and subscribe only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always fun to see who's joining us from across the globe. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soothing white noise. Let's dive into tonight's journey together. So you've decided to head west, a bold move. You've said goodbye to your home, your neighbors, and the idea of indoor plumbing. You're bound for Oregon, the land of opportunity, fertile soil, and rivers that want to kill you. But first, you gotta pack. And packing a wagon isn't like throwing stuff in for a weekend lake trip. This isn't, did I forget my toothbrush stress? It's more like, did I just forget a crucial axle pin that'll doom my whole family to starvation in the Rockies kind of stress? Your wagon's about the size of a modern minivan. No suspension, no insulation, no brakes. It's basically a shaky wooden box held together by hope and covered with a tarp that leaks at the worst times. Inside this fancy mobile coffin, you cram 6 months' worth of supplies, food, water, clothes, blankets, tools, spare parts, medicine, a tub of lard, your 5 kids, and somehow, your wife's piano. Spoiler alert, the piano won't survive Kansas. You're already arguing. Do you really need 2 boxes of flowers? Yes. Do you really need the cradle? Probably not. What about books? Definitely not. The rules are brutal. If it's not edible or fixable, you panic and toss it out the first time the wagon flips. Meanwhile, your oxen, the MVPs of this whole ordeal, are staring at you like you're the dumbest person who ever held a whip, half-trained, smelling of wet hay and judgment. They've already stepped on your foot twice. Your kids are restless. Your wife is mad because you flipped the chamber pot upside down. The neighbors watch you off, pretending to wave goodbye, secretly wondering if they can ransack your wagon once you're either back or dead in Wyoming. And then the wheel breaks. You don't move. First day, you're already bleeding from a splinter, soaked in sweat, wondering if this obvious death sentence is worth it. If you're wiped out before even leaving Independence, Missouri, just wait for your first prairie storm. And you thought you'd be riding your wagon like some frontier king, bouncing gently across the plains while the oxen do all the work. Think again. Reality hits about an hour after you finally leave Independence. Sitting inside the wagon is a luxury, and a miserable one at that. It's cramped, stifling, and every bump sends your spine into a mini mental breakdown. Inside is a mix of clinking cooking pots, wobbling wooden barrels, and the distinct aroma of dirty feet and salted pork. Plus, the kids are fighting over a single potato. So you get out and walk. Everyone does, because the wagon's overloaded. And sitting inside will wreck the wheels faster than neighborly disputes. The endless road ahead is rough, dry, and absolutely no fun. Dust kicks up with every step, sticking to your shoes, clothes, and throat. Dust gets in your eyes. Dust gets in your teeth. You can taste dirt more than breakfast. Your shoes, handcrafted by a guy in St. Louis who swore they were road ready, start betraying you by mile 5. Leather rubs your heels raw. You get blisters. You keep walking because what else are you going to do? Not get to Oregon. That's for sure. You freak out and toss it aside the first time your wagon flips. Meanwhile, your cows, the real MVPs of this whole mess, are staring at you like you're the dumbest creature ever to hold a whip. They're half-trained, sniffing the damp hay and judging you hard. And they've already stepped on your foot twice. Your wife's pacing nervously. She's mad because you flipped the chamber pot upside down. Neighbors watch, pretending to wave goodbye, secretly wondering if they'll end up rifling through your wagon once you either come back or kick the bucket out in Wyoming. Then, the wheel breaks. You still don't move. Today's the first day you've bled from a splinter, soaked in sweat, and wondered if this obvious fate is really worth all the hassle. If you're this wiped out before even leaving Independence, Missouri, just wait until you hit the first prairie storm. Yet here you are, thinking you'll ride your wagon like some frontier king, gently bouncing across the plains while the oxen do all the heavy lifting. Think again. Reality slams you about an hour after you finally leave Independence. Sitting in the wagon. Total luxury. And also a nightmare. It's cramped, stifling, and every bump sends your spine into a mini mental breakdown. Inside, it's a weird mix of clinking cooking pots, creaking barrels, and the unmistakable smell of dirty feet and salted pork. Plus, the kids are fighting over a potato. So yeah, you get out and walk. Everyone does because the wagon's overloaded, and sitting in it just wrecks the wheels faster than your neighbor's grudges. The endless road ahead is rough, dry, and zero fun. Dust kicks up with every step, sticking to your shoes, clothes, and throat. Dust gets in your eyes. Dust gets in your teeth. You're tasting dirt more than breakfast. Your handmade shoes, crafted by some guy in St. Louis who swore they were ready for the trip, start betraying you by mile 5. The leather rubs your heel raw. You get blisters. But you keep walking because what else can you do? Not get to Oregon, that's for sure. You trudge alongside the wagon, past those vacant-eyed oxen and their tail-wagging tantrums. You dodge piles of dung like landmines. You only stop to push the wagon out of ruts or refill the water jugs. The water's suspiciously blue from a dubious creek. The sun's blazing. It doesn't care about your dreams. It's roasting your neck, scalp, and soul. Sweat soaks your linen shirt, giving off a scent that'd scare the chickens. Meanwhile, your scalp and your spirit. Sweat soaks your linen shirt, giving off a stench that would scare the chickens. Meanwhile, you're trying to keep pace with a creature that looks like it's personally offended by your existence by noon. Your feet ache, socks soaked through, and someone announces you've trekked 7 miles. You collapse onto a rock, gasping for air, while someone cheerily reminds you only 2,000 miles to go. Welcome to the Oregon Trail. You thought this was a hike. Nope. It's more like a cardio workout in hell. Morning on the trail hits you like a slap. You sleep on the ground with a rock for a pillow and something suspiciously squishy under your blanket. Probably a beetle. Your back is a map of aches. Your mouth tastes like horse grease. And now, it's breakfast time. If you imagined sizzling bacon and eggs over a cozy campfire, well, bless your romantic heart. Reality serves something more like a punishment. You get a dented tin box, a plate, a spoon, yesterday's cold beans, and a biscuit that could double as legit building material. Beans colder than your ex's heart. Biscuit tougher than your morning mood. Despair sprinkled with soot. No coffee. Let me say that again. Coffee is for folks with cash, shelter, and hope. What you get is brown, lukewarm water filtered through a rag that once dried your cows. It tastes like dirt and postponed dreams. Still, you gulp it down because the alternative is death by thirst or drinking from the creek upstream of the dead mule. Someone tries to cheer you up by adding a spoon of molasses to the beans. It helps. Just a bit. Mostly. It just makes the beans stickier and harder to wash off your hands. Good news is, your hands are already filthy. So, what's one more layer of shame? You sit and eat on an overturned bucket while watching. Cows chew cud like they're in on some cosmic joke you missed. A nearby wagon family argues over whether to split their salted pork or just eat it all and die full. Grandma opts for the latter. A somber silence falls between bites. Then the bloating starts. Salted beans and regret don't digest easily. A toddler starts crying. Another kid asks if there's sugar in Oregon. You lie and say yes. Cleanup is just as glamorous. You scrape your plate with a stick, rinse your mouth with warm spit or a precious drop of water. Then toss it back into the wagon next to the sauerkraut jar you now absolutely despise. And that's the gourmet meal. Breakfast, lunch, dinner. If you're lucky, you get a slightly warmer regret. Meanwhile, you thought you'd be galloping noble horses across the plains, hair flowing like some 19th century action hero. Instead, you get bulls, 4 of them. Big necks, slow hooves, and as graceful as a wardrobe with legs. These creatures aren't here to inspire poetry. They're here to haul your 700-kilogram death cart over 2,000 miserable miles, and they are not happy about it. At first, you gave them cute names: Buttercup, Clover, Chestnut, and Hank. Now they keep their real names stubborn, gassy, almost useless, and Hank, still a total idiot. These oxen don't move fast, or at all unless they feel like it, which is rare. They just stand there, chewing slowly, staring into space like they're pondering life's meaning. You yell. They blink. You swing a stick. They fart. Sometimes they move, but only after you start walking away in despair. They can't drive either. They like to wander, usually toward poison ivy, hornet nests, or cliffs. Like their internal compass only points to chaos. You try to fix them, but scrambled egg brains, fear, and rain have already claimed your patient somewhere near mile 2. They're noisy, bellowing, snorting, groaning, like traveling with a trombone quartet. At night, you tie them to a tree and pray they don't wander off, tip the wagon, or plot against you under the moonlight. But here's the kicker. You need them desperately because you're not the... It's like their internal compass points straight to chaos. You try fixing them, but the egg yolk's twisted, rain's terrifying, and your patient died somewhere near mile 2, while they make noise, roar, snort, and moan like you're traveling with a trombone quartet. At night, you tie them to a tree and pray they don't wander off, tip over the wagon, or plot against you under the moonlight. But here's the kicker. You desperately need them because you're not the one pulling the wagon. Your 8-year-old son isn't either. No matter how eager he was back in Missouri, without oxen, your journey ends right there. So you feed them, groom them, and apologize after yelling at them, even though, deep down, you suspect they enjoy your misery. And when one goes lame, because of course it does, you drag everything slower, sadder, and pray the next trading post has a spare. They say, that's true, but it's respect built on fear, sweat, and knowing Hank could end your life just by refusing to budge. It happens sooner than you think. The moment you're trotting along at your usual 2.5 miles an hour, humming a tune to keep the tears at bay, then snap next thing you know. It breaks. There's a loud, sudden noise, like the wagon just gave up on life. Everyone stops. You look around. The cattle stand still, chewing, like nothing happened. The kids dig in the dirt, pretending it's a picnic. But you know, deep inside, you know something important just broke. Maybe it's the axle. A cursed wooden beam, somehow holding your entire future together. Or maybe it's the tongue. That long beam connecting your wagon to the cattle. Now lying in two, pitiful pieces like a broken bone. Either way, you're stuck. And it's day 3. You rummage through your stuff, looking for tools. You packed spare parts. Right. Or did you trade your spare wheel for a sack of apples back at Independence? Those apples are long gone. Eaten with regret. You find a hammer, a bent nail, and something that might be a butter churn lid. None of it helps. No mechanic, no emergency hotline. The nearest help is 30 meters away, and he's missing a wheel too. You consider using a branch as a makeshift fix. It works for about 12 feet. Then the whole wagon tips like a dying moose and dumps half your flour barrels onto the road. The flowers vanish, floating in the wind like your dreams under a blanket of white snow. The rest of the caravan. Because yes, you're not alone. Look at you politely, pretending not to judge. But totally judging. Someone whispers. Rookie, another, offers help in the lowest tone imaginable. You grin and tell them you've got it under control. Spoiler, you don't. By the end of the day, you've spent 6 hours whittling a wooden beam from firewood, wasting a whole day's effort, and realized your wagon parts seem made of glass and betrayal. Finally, you start moving again, slower, wobblier. Then someone asks, "Hey, where's the water barrel? You left it behind." Of course you did. You made it to the first river crossing. It's wide. It's muddy. It moves fast enough to make you question every single life choice you've ever made. On the other side, more trails, more misery. In the middle, your worst nightmare disguised as water. No bridge. Naturally, no bridge. This is 1845, not a weekend stroll. You have 3 options for it. Float it, or pray like hell and try both. Option 1, wade through. Drive the wagon straight like some kind of alien at the border. The water's waist deep, the current's strong, and the bottom's a mystery. Rocks, maybe holes, definitely. Eel monsters emotionally. Yes. Option 2, seal the wagon and float it. This means slathering tar or pitch on the bottom of your wooden wagon and convincing yourself it'll magically turn into a boat. You pile your terrified kids inside. Load up the food barrels. and push off, hoping it floats and doesn't instantly become an underwater coffin. Option 3, take a ferry. If you're lucky enough to be near one and can afford it. Some pioneers paid in silver, others in flour. One traded a goat. You traded your goat 2 days ago for a hat, so you're fighting this. Halfway across. One of the cattle freaks out and bolts to the side. The wagon tilts, the barrels slide, and your sauerkraut barrel. Waist-deep floods, raging currents, and a mysterious bottom. Rocks, maybe a hole, definitely. Eel monster, emotionally. Yes. Option 2, seal the wagon and float it. This means coating your wooden wagon bottom in tar or pitch, then convincing yourself it'll somehow turn into a boat. You cram your scared kids inside, pile on food barrels, and push off, hoping it'll float instead of instantly becoming a. You pack those crates full of food and shove off, hoping it floats instead of turning into an underwater coffin right away. Option 3, take the ferry. If you're lucky enough to be near one, and if you can actually afford it. Some pioneers paid in silver, others in flour. One guy traded a goat. You'd traded your goat 2 days ago for a hat, so you had to fight for it. Halfway there, one of the oxen freaks out and bolts sideways. The wagon tips, crates slide, and your barrel of sauerkraut explodes like the Titanic. Screams echo across the riverbank. You don't know if it's the ox, your wife, or your soul screaming. You make it to the other side, soaked, shivering, and missing a boot. You make it to the other side, soaked, shivering, and missing a boot. Everything is drenched. Clothes, gunpowder, flour, even your dignity. A wooden spoon floats by. It used to be in the soup pot. Now the pot's gone. The soup too. The kids are crying. You're crying. A cow's chewing grass like nothing happened. Another lies down, looking utterly resigned. You try to light a fire to dry off, but another cow lies down, looking like it's just resigned to its fate. You try to start a fire to dry off, but surprise wet wood won't catch. Eventually, you collapse beside the soaking wet wagon wheel, water dripping, utterly defeated, just in time to hear someone ask, "Isn't there a ferry half a mile upstream?" You know it's coming. Maybe you joked about it back in Missouri when everything was dry, clean, and hadn't yet been marred by horror. You laughed. Ha, ha, ha. Dentry. Just like in the game. But now, no laughs. You're sweating, shaking, sprinting toward the nearest bush. Disagreement doesn't send a polite RSVP. It doesn't ask for your health insurance. It hits faster than a ghost punch to your gut. 1 minute, you're casually enjoying some jerky. The next, your insides throw a tantrum, like they've been personally offended. At first, you blame bad beans, or maybe that suspicious green water from yesterday's creek. But then your stomach makes a noise so weird, the whole camp goes silent. Even the cows stare, and then you run. There's no bathroom on this trail, just nature and shame. You find a spot behind a bush, armed only with a ragged square of cloth and a prayer. Meanwhile, the rest of the group pretends not to notice. Spoiler, they notice. Oh, they notice. You spend the rest of the day hunched over, curled up, or clenching tight, depending on how generous the digestive gods feel. Your wagon keeps rolling without you. The kids ask why dad's walking weird and why mom smells like vinegar. No antibiotics, no painkillers, no doctor calls, just whiskey, boiled water, and hope your body remembers how to work. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you stop because your legs are too weak to carry all the regret. You try to hold water, but your canteen leaks and your backup water barrel is now laundry duty. You ask someone if you should just lie down and wait for sweet death. They laugh, but not the fun kind. More like, yeah, me too. By sunset, you're sitting upright just as another wagon buddy clutches their stomach and dashes for your bush. The fun's just starting. Everyone gets their turn. It's not a matter of if, just when. You start the new day optimistic. Rookie mistake. The sun's shining. The ground's dry. And for a fleeting moment, you think, hey, maybe today won't suck. That's when the Oregon Trail gods, those cruel, muddy little devils, decide to roll the weather dice. By mid-morning, the sun's turned into a stifling furnace. No shade, no clouds, and definitely no breeze. You sweat through your only shirt, which now smells like the last moments of a gym sock. Your hat barely shields you. Mostly just keeps the mosquitoes from laughing in your ear while you slap at yourself. You start stripping. First the jacket, then the scarf, then your dignity. Just as you get comfortable in your soaked wool misery, the wind kicks up. In minutes, the temperature drops like a corpse in the Snake River. You scramble to put everything back on, but everything's either lost, soggy, or mysteriously chewed at the edges. Thanks, goat. Clouds roll in, and suddenly the prairie turns into a horror flick. Thunder roars like a stampede of angry cattle. Rain lashes sideways. Your wagon tarp flaps like a sad, muddy kite, the woods soaking wet. So are your shoes, your socks, and your soul. Then hail hits. Not tiny stuff. It skips the polite pea-size intro and goes straight to grape-sized bullets from the sky. One chunks your shoulder, and you seriously consider writing a will. Another bounces off your coffee pot with a sharp ping that makes your cows try to lie down and surrender to nature. No shade, no clouds, and definitely no breeze. You sweat through your only shirt, which now smells like the last dying breaths of a gym sock. Your hat barely protects you, mostly just keeps the mosquitoes from laughing in your ears while you slap yourself repeatedly. You start peeling off layers. First your jacket, then your scarf, then your dignity. Just as you start feeling kinda cozy in your soggy sweater misery, the wind shows up in just a few minutes. The temperature drops like a dead body in Snake River. You scramble to put everything back on, but everything's either missing, soaked, or mysteriously chewed at the edges. Thanks, goat. Clouds roll in, and suddenly the prairie turns into a horror flick. Thunder booms like a stampede of angry cows. Rain lashes sideways. Your wagon tarp flaps like a muddy, sad kite trying to fly away. The firewood's soaked. So are your shoes, your socks, and your soul. Then hail hits. Not the polite kind. It skips the small talk and goes straight for grape-sized bullets from the sky. One hits your shoulder, and you seriously consider writing a will. Another bounces off the coffee pot with a sharp ping that makes your cows flop down and surrender to nature. Kids scream. Adults scream. One panicked guy chases his hat across the prairie like it owes him money. You crawl under the wagon, clutch a soggy blanket, and wonder if you'll ever feel warm again. After an hour of frost torture, it stops. Sun comes out. Your soul's feeling just as wrecked. Then hail starts falling, not just a sprinkle. It skips polite small talk and jumps straight to grape-sized bullets from the sky. One hits your shoulder, and you seriously consider writing a will. Another clinks off the coffee pot so sharply your oxen try to lie down and surrender to nature. Kids are screaming. Adults are screaming. Some dude is chasing his hat across the prairie like it owes him money. You dive under the wagon, clutching a soggy blanket, wondering if you'll ever feel warm again. After an hour of this icy torture, it stops. The sun peeks out, birds sing. A rainbow shows up, like it's mocking you. You crawl out from under the wagon, looking like a soaked cookie. Someone hands you a cup of warm water. You take a sip. It's bean juice. Again, you silently nod. Defeated, someone hands you a cup of warm water. You take a sip. It's bean water. Again, you silently nod. Defeated, because you already know what's coming next. Night falls. And somehow, everything gets worse. Remember when you proudly stuffed your cart with sacks of flour, salted pork, beans, and dreams back at Independence Well? Daylight or not, everything looks suspiciously awful. You open a box of hard bread and discover it's got the texture of limestone and the flavor of historical punishment. There's movement, and no, not metaphorically, literally. You shut it and pretend you didn't see it. Salted pork. You were warned it might last a while. What they didn't mention was time flies faster when the box isn't sealed properly and one of your cows uses it as a scratching post. Now it's covered in a white furry coat of despair. You scrape it off. That's exactly what everyone did. Scrape and eat. Then pray. Your flour is clumpy. Your beans are wormy. Even your sugar smells like it's been on a world tour. You shake your empty coffee tin. You cry a little. Then comes the water. The sparkling soda bucket is now just a lukewarm soup with floating twigs, dead flies, and a mystery blob you're not about to poke. You strain it through a rag, maybe a sock once, convincing yourself it's clean. But it's not. Dinner tonight is stew. Technically, it's a gray, unidentifiable mush of mystery beans, suspicious pork, and a carrot that's seen better centuries. The flavor best described as boiling sadness. You chew slowly, telling yourself it's better than nothing. It's not. Someone finds a cracker from day one, hard enough to deflect arrows. You smash it with a rock. Inside is a tiny beetle. You name it Larry. Larry is the most nutritious part of your day. Rotating food is like a game of edible Russian roulette. You sniff everything twice, then still eat it, because the only other option is starving. And that's not some noble spiritual journey. It's just hunger in a carriage next to a guy, noisily chomping on sauerkraut. By the end of the meal, you're full but anxious. There's a certain simmering feeling. You find yourself staring at the bushes again. Another day, another meal, another reason you're probably not cut out for this life. You wake up to sobbing. Not the usual kind. Not a kid whining about blisters or someone groaning over bad beans. No, this time it's serious. A heavy finale. You step out of the carriage and instantly know someone died last night. Maybe old man Jenkins, who looked like he was held together by gravel and jerky, or the girl with the stubborn cough that wouldn't quit, or the baby born 3 days ago under the carriage during a storm. You don't even know her name. No funeral. No coffin banging. No solemn organ. Just a shallow grave dug into hard earth with a shovel that also scooped beans. The body wrapped in the least moldy blanket available, lowered carefully, or at least with a terrifying urgency. Your group's pastor, who doubles as the blacksmith, says a few words. Something about dust, eternity, and God's will. Someone coughs. Someone else mutters about moving on because the dead don't wait. But neither does the trail. No tombstones, just a pile of rocks to keep the diggers at bay. If you have time, carve a name on a piece of wood. If not, well, they'll be forgotten by the next rainstorm. Sometimes you wonder how many graves you've passed without knowing. You try not to think about it. You focus on the wheels, the cows, the miles ahead. You eat lunch with grief in your mouth. A child asks why. Grandma isn't walking today. You lie again. At first, it shocks you. Then it fades. Then it becomes routine. Today, the woman isn't walking. He's lying again. At first, it knocks you sideways. Then it fades. Then it just becomes routine. Someone dies. You bury them. You keep moving. Stats say that's normal. 1 in 10 people never pull it off. Sickness, accidents, childbirth, exhaustion. You were warned. You just didn't think it'd be someone you knew, someone you shared molasses with, someone who helped push your wagon out of the mud. Now they're under the ground, and the trail of sorrow stretches on. Oregon. Trail grief has no pause button. By now, you know, Missouri. And even then, it's like a sponge rubbed with warm water and half a bar of soap melting on skin. Now you're lucky if you can splash creek water on your face without it being squirrel corpse runoff. The Oregon Trail isn't some wild adventure. It's a slow slog with a herd of cattle. But just when you think the worst is behind you, quarrels, blisters, funerals, nature decides to throw a welcome committee. First up, prairie wolves. They howl at night like a middle school flute recital. Loud, off-key, and utterly unsettling. At first, you think it's wolves. Then someone says, nope, wolves are quieter. Prairie wolves want you to know they're mocking you. How comforting. Then there are snakes. Oh, the snakes. One morning, you roll up your blanket and find a guest curled up inside, sleeping like they pay rent. That's a rattlesnake. You scream. Nope. It just sticks out its tongue, like it doesn't care about your shrieks, and casually slithers off looking for less dramatic prey. By midday, while filling your water jug, you spot tracks. Not buffalo. Not folks. Big. Clawed prints, maybe bear. Maybe mountain lion. Either way, your chances of winning a fistfight are somewhere between scary and laughable. And let's talk about bears. If you think these furry bandits are cute, you've never seen one expertly unlock your food bag like a surgeon, stealing your last snack while staring into your soul. One even tried to climb into the wagon at night. You threw a boot at it. It threw one back. But the real star moment, the skunk swaggering into camp like it owns the place. You try to quietly take off your shoes because, you know, sanity. But someone thought loud clapping was a great idea. Wrong move. The skunk turns its fluffy tail to the crowd and unleashes a stench so potent it could cause a full-blown existential crisis. For 3 days, everything, clothes, wagon, your soul reeked of revenge. At this point, buffalo are the only creatures you trust, and even they're giving you side-eye like they're plotting a mutiny. Wildlife on the Oregon Trail doesn't care about your grim fate. It wants your food, your shoes, and your dignity in that order. Somewhere around mile 500, you stop noticing all the terrible smells. Not because it's gotten better, but because your brain quietly waved the white flag and checked out. Honestly, you haven't showered since Missouri. And back then, it was more like rubbing a sponge with warm water and half a melting bar of soap on your skin. Now, you're lucky if you can splash creek water on your face without it coming off smelling like dead squirrel. You want to change clothes, but your clean ones are buried under 3 sacks of flour and a screaming chicken. Even if you could reach them, they're just as filthy. Everything is dust, sweat, and sticky goo. Your socks have become a biohazard. Your boots smell like they're fermenting, and your hair a crunchy monument to dust, grease, and despair. If a bird landed on it, you probably wouldn't even notice. Honestly, you might even feel better with some company. You've thought about laundry. You really could do it. But that requires water. Precious water rationed like gold. Using it on yourself instead of your cow treason. You suggested a creek bath once, but then remembered Jimmy did that and broke out in a rash at the stream. Jimmy hasn't been the same since brushing your teeth. Fun times. Remember chewing on a twig. Your breath could qualify as a lethal weapon. You want to change clothes, but your clean outfit is buried under 3 barrels of flour and a screaming chicken. And even if you could get to it, it'd still be filthy. Everything is covered in dust, sweat, and stickiness. Your socks have become a biohazard. Your shoes smell like they're fermenting. And your hair is a crunchy monument to road dust, grease, and despair. If a bird landed in there, you wouldn't even notice. Actually, you might even feel better having company. You've thought about washing up. You actually could, but that requires water. Precious drinking water rationed out like gold. Using it on yourself instead of the cow treason. You once suggested bathing in the creek, but then remembered Jimmy did that and broke out in a rash. Your hair is basically a crunchy monument to dust, grease, and despair. If a bird landed there, you wouldn't even notice. Honestly, you might even prefer some company. You've thought about washing up. You really could, but that requires water. Precious drinking water is ration tight. Using it on yourself instead of your ox is basically treason. You suggested bathing in a stream once, but then remembered that kid Jimmy did that and got a rash. Jimmy hasn't been the same since brushing your teeth. Fun times. Remember chewing on a twig. Your breath could be a lethal weapon. You scared off a panda just by yawning. The wagon itself smells like a mobile compost heap, a mix of dirty humans. Spoiled smoked meat grease, wet tarps, and whatever's fermenting in that sauerkraut barrel nobody dares to open for 3 days. Every night, you curl up in that mess, wrapped in a damp blanket with maybe some mold growing on it, pretending you're still human. Still, no one said a word. Everyone stinks. 2 people pass each other and nod respectfully, not like friends, but like survivors of the Great Smell-Off. A damp blanket might or might not have mold growing on it, and you just pretend you're still a functioning human. So far, no one's bought it. Comments: nah. Everyone stinks? 2 folks pass each other, nodding with respect, not like buddies, but like survivors of the Oda Wars, cleanliness, comfort, and joy, left behind somewhere in Missouri, probably near the middle of nowhere. It hits you. Why am I even doing this? You don't even remember anymore. Was it the promise of free land, adventure, or a cousin in Oregon who wrote before vanishing in a logging accident? You stare at the endless wagons, all looking exactly the same, and start suspecting this isn't a journey, but a slow, dusty mistake. Your back hurts, your legs ache, your face feels like sandpaper, and your cattle, blatantly ignoring your orders, look healthier than you do. Your travel buddies aren't faring better. One guy talks to his wagon wheel. His wife stays silent in Kansas except for swearing at the firewood. Your kid asks if Oregon even has beds and food. And you answer, with the vague confidence of someone who has no clue. You find a flat rock and sit not because you're tired, but because your soul needs a moment to mourn. You used to be someone. You had shoes with soles. You had dreams. Now you're sunburned, and your shirt smells like despair. A tumbleweed rolls by, like it's mocking you. You try to journal, but the ink's dry, and your fingers hurt too much to hold a pen, so you just stare, think, and regret. Then someone in your group cheerfully shouts, "Only 1,000 miles to go." You don't answer. You just lie back on the dusty ground and blend into the prairie. A vulture circles overhead. You wave. It waves back. Maybe later, you overhear someone say, "At least the trail builds character." You nod seriously, then mutter, "I liked my old character better." As night falls, you stop asking if things will get easier. Now you wonder if they'll just get worse. And that's the whole vibe of the Oregon Trail. Not hope, not grit, but a quiet, dusty kind of acceptance. You keep moving, not because you want to, but because turning back means walking. By now, you're not really functioning like a normal human anymore. You've gone wild quietly, dustily, and extremely dehydrated. You don't see the wagon as a tool or burden anymore. It's your only companion, your home, your enemy, your therapist. You find yourself talking to it. At first, just muttering, "Get over this hill, girl." Then deep conversations. "No, I don't think the oxen are pulling their hardest. Thanks for asking." If anyone overheard, they wouldn't mention it. They start whispering about you in the same tone they use for a lame horse. The wagon doesn't judge you. Unlike the rest of the group, it doesn't ask where the last sack of flour went. Spoiler, it spilled down a ravine. It doesn't sigh when you burn dinner. It just reassures you. You tell yourself that means it understands. Now you've personalized it, given it a name, something solid like Clara or Old Mord. You pat it gently in the morning. You apologize when the wheel hits a rock too hard, when it groans under the weight. You whisper, "You know, girl, you know." One day, someone catches you polishing an axle with your shirt sleeve, murmuring sweet nothings about reinforced wooden pegs. They back away slowly, probably wisely, and it's not just the wagon. You're emotionally bonding with anything heavy and silent. Your shovel is your soulmate. Your coffee pot is a beacon of hope. The dent in your lunchbox reminds you of the hailstorm in Chapter 8. You cherish it. The trail strips away everything unnecessary hygiene, humility, social norms. What's left just you. A few dented cooking tools, seriously dehydrated now. The wagon's no longer just a tool or a burden. It's your only buddy, your home, your enemy, your therapist. You catch yourself talking to it. At first, just mumbling, "Get over this hill, girl." Then deep chats. "No, I don't think the oxen are actually giving it their all. Thanks for asking. If anyone overheard, they wouldn't mention it." They start whispering about you in the tone you'd use for a lame horse. The wagon doesn't judge you. unlike the rest of the crew. It doesn't ask where the last sack of flour disappeared to. Spoiler, it fell into a ravine. It doesn't sigh when you burn dinner. It just makes you feel a little less crazy. You tell yourself that means it gets you. Now you've personalized it, given it a name, something solid like Clarara or Old Mord. You pat it gently in the morning. You apologize when the wheels bash a rock too hard, when it groans under the weight. You whisper, you know. Girl, you know, one day, someone spots you polishing the axle with your shirt sleeve, murmuring sweet nothings about the wooden peg reinforcements. They slowly back away, probably wisely. And it's not just the wagon. You're emotionally attached to anything heavy and silent. Your shovel's your soulmate. Your coffee pot is hope in a metal cup. That dent in your lunchbox, a souvenir from the hailstorm in Chapter 8. You cherish it. The trail has stripped away all the fluff hygiene, modesty, social norms. What's left you? Some battered cooking gear, and a cart that looks more real than half the friends you started with. They see you polishing the wagon axle with your shirt sleeve, muttering sweet nothings to the reinforced wooden peg. They back off, probably wisely. It's not just the wagon. You're emotionally attached to anything heavy and silent. The shovel's your soulmate. The coffee pot's your beacon of hope. The dent in your lunchbox is a reminder of the hailstorm in Chapter 8. You cherish it. The trail has stripped away everything unnecessary hygiene, humility, social norms. What's left is you. A few battered cooking tools, and a wagon that looks more real than half the people you started with. At night, you rest your head on the wooden frame of your home on wheels and dream about life off the trail. Somewhere with chairs, walls, and meals without bugs. Maybe the Clarara wagon will come with you. Maybe she'll retire. Next to your cabin is a worn monument to the shared suffering of the two of you. Or maybe she'll end up firewood. But tonight, she's your best friend. You made it. You're in Oregon. You're still standing, but barely. And so is your wagon. Even if you did it. You made it to Oregon. You're still standing. Barely. And so is your wagon. Even if, now, it sounds like a dying whale every time it turns a corner. The cattle have stopped acknowledging your existence. They just stare at the horizon like they've seen way too much. After more than 2,000 miserable miles, you've arrived at the promised land. You expected lush valleys, birdsong, and cheering crowds, welcoming their hero. Instead, you get rain. Endless rain soaking into your bones, eroding your soul. The trail finally ends at a muddy patch that looks more like a swamp than the promised land. Fields of muck. Trees glaring judgmentally. And the welcome committee is just another group of wagons arguing over who gets the driest patch of grass. You squint around, waiting for that miraculous moment, that feeling of victory, fulfillment, purpose. But all you feel is exhaustion and itchiness, probably lice. A man hands you a shovel and says, "Welcome. Start digging." You think he's joking. He's not. No town. No cozy cabin waiting. No warm stew handed gratefully by settlers. Just dirt. Wet. Wild. Raw dirt. Yours. Apparently. As long as you survive, build, and grow stuff on it instead of dying on it. You glance at your family. They look like background extras in a zombie movie. Dirty, ragged, emotionally drained. The baby's chewing on a rock. No one has the energy to stop her. Your wagon. Clara shudders one last time and collapses into a pile of broken wood. You whisper thanks and pretend you feel nothing. Slowly, you realize this isn't the end of anything. It's just the next chapter of hard work, terrible food, unpredictable weather, and cattle drama. But you also realize something else. You made it. Not everyone does. Not everyone can. You've changed, hardened, maybe obsessed, but you survived the Oregon Trail. And if you can do that, maybe you really can do anything except eat another salted pea. You won't have to worry about that anymore. In the grand political theater of ancient times, Cleopatra II of Egypt wasn't just playing her part. She rewrote the script. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony are often romanticized, but deep down, these were cold, calculated alliances for survival and power. When Cleopatra became Queen of Egypt in 31 BC, she wasn't alone. She co-ruled with her brother, Ptolemy III, as was tradition. But the young king's advisors quickly sidelined her, pushing Cleopatra into exile. Her reaction wasn't to raise an army or beg for mercy. It was to ally with the most powerful man in the world. Cleopatra knew that a Roman alliance meant securing her kingdom's future. She famously had herself smuggled into Julius Caesar's residence, reportedly rolled up in a carpet, dramatic as that sounds. She offered Caesar something far more valuable than affection, stability in a volatile region, and Egypt's wealth in grain and gold. Caesar, busy with civil war back home, recognized the advantage. He helped Cleopatra defeat her brother and restore her as queen. Shortly after, their son Caesarion was born, though never officially recognized by Rome. Years later, Cleopatra repeated this strategy. When Caesar was assassinated, the Roman world shattered. Cleopatra saw another opportunity. She forged a powerful political and personal alliance with Mark Antony, one of Rome's ruling trio. She bore him 3 children, and together they ruled vast territories from Egypt to Syria, bringing her back as queen. Soon after, their son, Caesarion, was born, even if Rome never officially recognized him. Years later, Cleopatra tried the same trick again. When Caesar was assassinated, the Roman world shattered. Cleopatra saw another chance. She formed a powerful alliance, political and personal, with Mark Antony, one of Rome's ruling trio. She bore him 3 kids, and together they ruled vast lands from Egypt to Syria. Their partnership was a direct challenge to Octavian, the future Augustus, who used their relationship as propaganda fodder. Cleopatra's often painted as a scheming Eastern seductress who corrupted a noble Roman general. The truth way, more complicated. She used marriage and motherhood as tools to rule her kingdom. She wasn't just seducing Roman men for fun. She was securing her dynasty's place in an increasingly Roman-dominated world. Her downfall wasn't from a bad move in romance, but a miscalculation in the ruthless game of power. When Mark Antony and Cleopatra lost at Actium, it wasn't just the end of a romance. It was the collapse of a centuries-old diplomatic strategy. Cleopatra's life proves that in the ancient world, marriage wasn't about love. It was about power leverage. Before Cleopatra turned marriage into a weapon, another queen showed how it's done. Olympias, mother of Alexander the Great, born into the ruling clan of Epirus. Olympias was married off to King Philip II of Macedon as part of a strategic alliance. On paper, a classic royal marriage. But Olympias wasn't content being just a pretty face. She played a long game. Philip II didn't lack wives. His marriages were mostly political, each aimed at securing loyalty from various tribes across Macedon. Olympias stood out not just as the mother of the heir, but as ridiculously smart, deeply religious, and politically savvy. She joined the cult of Dionysus, rumored to sleep with snakes, and claimed her son was divine. When Philip started marrying other women, tensions flared. One of his later marriages to a young Macedonian noblewoman threatened Olympias's status and Alexander's legitimacy. Olympias was exiled, and Alexander kept his distance from court life. But then came the shocking assassination of Philip at his daughter's wedding, a murder many believe Olympias orchestrated. After Philip died, she returned to court not as a widow, but as a regent queen. Her son Alexander became king at just 20 years old. While he was off conquering Persia, Olympias stayed behind, fiercely guarding the throne. She eliminated political threats, crushed rival factions, and executed anyone who questioned her power. She wasn't satisfied with ceremonial influence. She demanded real control, sometimes in brutal fashion. What makes Olympias remarkable is that marriage wasn't the end of her political journey. It was just the start. She used her status as Philip's queen to give birth to a future conqueror, then used that same status to wield power independently. Even after Alexander's death, she schemed to protect her grandson's inheritance amid the chaos of succession wars. Eventually, her enemies caught up, and she was executed in a power struggle. But her legacy lived on. Olympias proved royal. Women could be more than passive political symbols. In fact, they could be empire builders. Her story laid the groundwork for queens like Cleopatra. Who knew that, in the ancient world, power often came wrapped in a wedding veil, while Olympias and Cleopatra used marriage to seize or hold on to power in unstable lands. Livia Drusilla played a different game. The long-lasting influence of the empire came from Rome's most powerful family. Her marriage to Octavian, who became Augustus, Rome's first emperor, wasn't just a love story. It was a calculated mix of prestige, wealth, and dynastic ambition. Livia was married and pregnant when she first met Octavian. But that didn't stop him. He was either hopelessly smitten or so strategically motivated that he forced a quick divorce on both sides. Livia's husband was exiled, and just a few months later, she married the future emperor, who was still living off her previous marriage's baby. This was the kind of scandal that could have wrecked the Roman Republic's reputation. But the tidal wave of power shifts. A few months later, she married the future emperor, who was still pregnant from his previous marriage. Now that's the kind of scandal that could wreck the Roman Republic's rep. But the tides of power were shifting. Old rules were getting swept away. Even though Livia never bore Augustus children, their marriage became the pivot around the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Augustus adopted Livia's two sons from her first marriage, Tiberius and Drusus. It was basically a merger of two powerful bloodlines. Livia became Rome's ultimate matron, calm, devout, politically connected, but behind the scenes, she was anything but passive. Livia played the role of Augustus's key advisor for decades, but behind the scenes, she was anything but passive. Livia was Augustus's go-to advisor for decades. Ancient sources say she quietly pulled all the strings, masterminding succession plans. knocking out rivals, and running the empire's internal politics. She was basically the original puppet master. Her palace manipulations were so slick, they got mistaken for family virtue. Tacitus, a guy who never held back his skepticism, later accused her of poisoning opponents, including potential heirs, to make sure her son Tiberius snagged the crown, whether true or not. Who cares? What matters is Roman historians actually believed she could pull that off. That alone says a lot about her power. When Augustus died, he left Livia not just a mountain of cash, but real political muscle. She got the title Augusta and was worshipped in temples. Yeah, like a goddess. Her influence over Tiberius was intense and often tense, but undeniable. She helped build a royal dynasty out of what started as a marriage. Livia's story shows how Roman women, despite having no official political office, still wielded dynastic power through marriage in the empire. Alliances weren't just made on battlefields, they were forged in bedrooms, cradles, and bloodlines. Fast forward almost 800 years, and here we are at the court of Charlemagne, the Frankish king and Carolingian emperor. Unlike Cleopatra or Livia, Charlemagne wasn't about using marriage to climb the ladder. He was the ladder. But how he handled alliance marriages, especially with his daughters, reveals a new royal control tactic: strategic singlehood. Charlemagne married multiple times and had plenty of concubines. Each marriage was political, a tool to cement ties with powerful Germanic tribes, Lombard kings, or Frankish nobles. But when it came to his daughters, he got weirdly possessive. In an era when princesses were basically diplomatic currency, Charlemagne refused to marry his girls off to foreign rulers or even local nobles. Why, no one knows for sure. Some scholars think he feared powerful sons-in-law could challenge his rule or mess with the fragile noble loyalties. Others say it was about control. By keeping his daughters unmarried, he ensured all future dynasty decisions came straight from his bloodline, free from outside influence. But that didn't mean his daughters lived like nuns. Some had long-term lovers, or even illegitimate kids sometimes right under Charlemagne's roof. Instead of punishing them, he let these side deals slide quietly. Guess he preferred domestic chaos over geopolitical headaches. It's a weird contradiction: public purity, private tolerance. Still, this policy had consequences. It robbed the Carolingian Empire of diplomatic marriage opportunities at a time when unions could settle border disputes or stabilize regions. More importantly, it left his daughters in social limbo. Royal blood, but no official role. They weren't queens or true power players. They lived in a gilded kind of purgatory. After Charlemagne died, his devout son Louis reversed this, marrying off female relatives to strengthen alliances. But the precedent was set. Marriage wasn't a given for royal daughters. It was a weapon to be wielded or withheld. Charlemagne's unique strategy showed that blocking marriage could be just as political as arranging one. The Carolingian Empire's diplomatic potential, back when marriage was basically the ancient version of a border peace treaty or regional stability plan. More importantly, this stuck his daughters in this awkward social limbo. Royal blood, but not quite official. Role-wise, they weren't queens or legit court insiders. They lived in a sort of gilded purgatory after Charlemagne died. His son, Louis the Pious, flipped the script, marrying off female relatives to secure alliances. But the precedent was set. Marriage wasn't a given for royal daughters. It was a weapon you could hold on to or throw around. Charlemagne's clever move showed that blocking a marriage could be just as political as arranging one. In royal alliance politics, even doing nothing sends a loud message. In Constantinople, where Roman tradition met Eastern scheming, marriage alliances took on a whole new flavor, mixing imperial theology, social climbing, and some seriously theatrical politics. No one shows this better than Empress Theodora, wife of Justinian Bai. Unlike Olympus-born royals, or illustrates this better than Empress Theodora, wife of Justinian Phi. Unlike Olympus, born into royalty, or Livia from royal bloodlines. Theodora started life far from the marble palaces of power. She was the daughter of a bear trainer and, according to some sources, once worked as an actress and courtesan backgrounds that would have gotten her banned from marrying into most noble families. But Justinian saw something different in her brains, charm, and a political savvy that was off the charts. Despite fierce opposition from the Byzantine elite, he married her, and she became empress in 527. Theodora's rise wasn't just a personal win. It smashed the established marriage system. Byzantine emperors were expected to marry noblewomen from prestigious families to cement alliances. By choosing Theodora, Justinian broke tradition and signaled that his reign would be marked by centralized power, reform, and unpredictability. And she did not disappoint. After becoming empress, Theodora became Justinian's most trusted advisor. She co-authored laws, influenced religious policy, and even drafted imperial decrees. During the Nika riots, a violent uprising threatening to topple the regime, it was Theodora who urged Justinian not to run away. Her legendary line, "Purple makes a fine shroud," convinced him to stand firm, crush the rebellion, and save the empire. Theodora also fought for women's rights, passing laws protecting actresses, banning forced prostitution, and improving legal protections for women. Her reforms weren't just moral, they were political. By reshaping the legal status of lower-class women, she broadened her support base and weakened the elite's monopoly on power. Her marriage to Justinian wasn't a traditional noble alliance. It was a partnership of ideals and ambition. Yet it sent shockwaves across the empire. Nobles were furious, but the common folk saw hope. Foreign courts recognized the power of this duo, and their united front made Byzantium look more stable and formidable. Theodora's story shows that a marriage can do more than reflect politics. It can rewrite the whole game. In the Byzantine Empire, love and power weren't opposites. They fueled each other's rise. Few medieval European women wielded greater influence through marriage than Eleanor of Aquitaine. Born in 1122, Eleanor inherited the vast, wealthy duchy of Aquitaine, making her one of Europe's most coveted duchesses. But Eleanor wasn't just a prize to be won. She used marriage, not just to hold power, but to shape the political map of France and England for generations. Her first marriage was to Louis VII of France. It was a political alliance by the book. The French crown wanted control of Aquitaine, and marrying Eleanor brought that at least for a while. But the match was a disaster. Louis was devout, rigid, and indecisive. Eleanor was smart, independent, and ambitious. They fought constantly, especially during the disastrous Second Crusade. When Eleanor insisted on commanding her own army, and rumors swirled that she was having an affair with her uncle, Raymond of Antioch. Their marriage was annulled in 1152, officially for consanguinity, but really because they couldn't stand each other and only had daughters. Right after, Eleanor did something shockingly bold. She married Henry, Duke of Normandy, who later became Henry II of England. With one move, she flipped loyalty and Aquitaine's wealth from France to England, sparking centuries of tension. As Queen of England, Eleanor bore 8 kids, including Richard, the Lionheart, and King John. Loyalty and wealth from Aquitaine to England stirred up centuries of tension. As Queen of England, Eleanor had 8 kids, including Richard, the Lionheart, and King John. But she wasn't just busy popping out heirs. She was hands-on with management, helping run the lands, and even leading a rebellion against Henry when their marriage fell apart. She spent 15 years in prison, proving she was quite the political threat after Henry's death. Eleanor re-emerged as a serious power broker. She negotiated Richard's release from captivity, arranged royal marriages across Europe, and ruled England while he was away. Her alliance network, woven carefully with both blood and promises, stretched from Sicily all the way to Castile. Eleanor's marriage wasn't just a personal choice or noble duty. It was a tectonic shift in medieval geopolitics. Her alliances made and broke empires, redefined loyalty, and proved that a woman, when positioned right, could redraw the map of Europe. With Eleanor, political marriage hit a whole new level, not just building empires, but mastering them. No dynasty perfected the art of political marriage like the Habsburgs. From late Middle Ages to modern times, this powerful European family expanded power not by bloodshed, but by strategically marrying into every royal house worth chasing. Their motto might as well have been, "Why fight when you can marry your way to the top?" The mastermind behind this was Maximilian Führer, Holy Roman Emperor. In the late 15th century, his marriage to Mary of Burgundy in 1477 handed the wealthy and rebellious Burgundy territories to the Habsburgs, a move that secured his family a foothold in Western Europe and kept the French sweating for centuries. But Maximilian's boldest move was all about his kids. His son, Philip the Handsome, married Joanna of Castile, heiress to the merged Spanish kingdoms of Aragon and Castile. That marriage produced Charles V, arguably the most powerful man in 16th century Europe. Charles inherited Spain, the Netherlands, Austria, and parts of Italy not by conquest, but by carefully arranged weddings. He even ruled lands in the Americas, all thanks to paperwork, not warfare. The Habsburgs took this strategy to near ridiculous extremes. They were infamous for marrying off cousins, nieces, even uncles too, nieces nonstop. Keeping power in the family worked until it didn't. Generations of inbreeding led to health disasters. Most famously, Charles II of Spain, who was physically and mentally frail, thanks to centuries of genetic bottlenecking. Still, the political gains were undeniable. The Habsburgs held thrones in Spain, Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, and even parts of Italy in the New World, all without mobilizing massive armies. Their empire was maintained with rings, not swords, but relying on marriage diplomacy had risks. If a marriage didn't produce an heir, or the heir was no good, it could wreck decades of careful planning. Succession crises popped up often, and wars still broke out when rival claims came from the same family tree. The Habsburgs proved marriage wasn't just a tool in the diplomatic toolbox. It was the whole toolbox. In the early modern world, no bullet was fired before a marriage promise was sealed. For centuries, the Habsburgs showed that wedding bells could ring louder than war drums. Catherine de' Medici didn't just marry to grab power. She wielded it like a scalpel during one of Europe's most chaotic eras. Born into the insanely wealthy Medici banking dynasty in 1519, Catherine was married off to Henry, Duke of Orleans, the future King of France. At age 14, this marriage was arranged to cement ties between the powerful Pope and the French crown classic political bookkeeping disguised as a wedding. At first, Catherine seemed sidelined. Her husband openly favored his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, and for years, Catherine couldn't produce an heir. But when Henry ascended the throne and then died in a jousting accident, everything changed. Catherine became the queen mother to 3 kings in a row: Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III. All of them were too young or weak to rule alone. So Catherine ruled for them. Amid escalating conflicts between French Catholics and Protestant Huguenots, Catherine turned to marriage as her political scalpel. Her most controversial move happened in 1572, when she arranged the marriage of her daughter, Marguerite de Valois, to Prince Henry of Navarre, a Protestant. The grand plan: to bring peace to a divided kingdom through a symbolic union. Instead, this wedding lit the fuse for one of the bloodiest chapters in French history. Just days after the wedding, Catholic mobs unleashed a massacre targeting the Huguenot guests in an event now known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Thousands were slaughtered, and Catherine has been accused then and now as the mastermind behind the whole bloody ambush. Whether she directly ordered the killings is still debated, but she definitely used the marriage to lure Protestant leaders into a vulnerable trap. Even after the massacre, Catherine didn't quit her marriage game. She spent years negotiating royal marriages, hoping to balance the power of French noble families and keep the crown in control. Through it all, she held power in France not as a warrior, but as a mom, a matchmaker, and a master manipulator. Catherine de' Medici turned royal weddings into a chessboard where every bride and groom was a pawn in a much bigger game. Her legacy, excellence, and bloodshed, proof that, in the risky early modern European world, a marriage could just as easily spark a war as it could end one. From Cleopatra to Catherine de' Medici, marriage was wielded like a sword, sharp, strategic, and often double-edged across ancient and early modern worlds. Royal marriages rarely started with love. They were carefully planned diplomatic moves to solidify power, build peace, or crush rivals. Yet, despite all the pomp and supposed permanence, these alliances were fragile, their outcomes wildly unpredictable. On the surface, marriage promised stability. Cleopatra's marriage to Mark Antony, Eleanor of Aquitaine's marriages to French and English kings, or Catherine de' Medici's marriage diplomacy, all aimed to end conflict through marriage. But usually, these alliances just delayed or even sparked inevitable power struggles. What's striking is how consistent this approach was across time and culture. Whether Macedonians used marriage to hold together a fracturing Greek world, Romans merged noble families to secure succession, or the Habsburgs swallowed territories through vows, the logic stayed the same: control the family and you control the future. But this strategy came with a cost, especially for the women involved. Princesses stopped being individuals and turned into bargaining chips. Their worth was measured by dowries. strategic position, and their baby-making potential. Still, some women, like Olympias, Theodora, Eleanor, and Catherine, played this system so well that they went from pawns on the board to the players moving the pieces. Yet, the system was never perfect. Marriages failed, heirs died, political tides shifted. What started as a dynastic fix often collapsed into crisis, civil war, or dynasty extinction. For example, the Habsburgs' extreme inbreeding eventually weakened the very bloodline they aimed to preserve. By modern times, marriage alliances lost their grip on geopolitics. The rise of nationalism, democracy, and modern diplomacy chipped away at marriage's political role. However, echoes still linger in constitutional monarchies, in ceremonial state visits, and in the enduring obsession with royal weddings. The politics of ancient marriage alliances were never just about feelings or appearances. They were about survival for centuries. A royal wedding wasn't merely a personal event. It was a declaration of intent. A war or peace move marked by a kiss, or rather, by a contract and a crown. War or peace sealed with a kiss, or more precisely, with a contract and a crown. The story of the Trail of Tears doesn't start with soldiers and wagons. It began decades earlier in the rich forests of the American Southeast. This land's long been home to the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole peoples. And no, these weren't isolated tribes clueless about European culture. They had trade networks, complex governance, agriculture, and diplomacy, all polished over centuries. By the early 1800s, many tribes were actively trying to coexist with a growing United States. Some even embraced European customs, Christianity, formal constitutions, plantations, and yes, slave ownership. But none of that really mattered. After the War of 1812, as the U.S. population exploded, so did the hunger for land, especially in the South, where cotton quickly became king. White settlers, backed by local militias and opportunistic politicians, started muscling into native lands, steamrolling boundaries with a smug sense of entitlement, all wrapped up in the shiny ideology of manifest, destiny, the divine right of Americans to stretch coast to coast, despite official treaties guaranteeing native tribes sovereignty over their ancestral lands. Those agreements were routinely ignored or renegotiated under pressure. Legal battles flared, and some tribal leaders still clung to hope that diplomacy could protect their autonomy. The Cherokee Nation, in particular, went to heroic lengths to defend their rights. They set up a constitutional government, printed newspapers, and took their case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court in Worcester v. Georgia, and they actually won. But a court ruling is only as powerful as the folks enforcing it. Andrew Jackson, the famously stubborn president, refused to act, reportedly saying, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now, let him enforce it." Meanwhile, violence and harassment against Native communities ramped up. Militia attacks, arson, and forced land grabs became daily occurrences. The Southeast was turning into a pressure cooker, and the federal government was busy setting up the legal and logistical groundwork for something unprecedented: the systematic removal of entire Native populations from their homelands. The seeds of removal weren't sown by sudden cruelty, but through decades of calculated policies, prejudice, and cold indifference. The stage was set. Western trails were being cleared, and the tears hadn't started flowing yet. But, oh, they would, and in unimaginable numbers. When Andrew Jackson was elected president in 1828, the fate of the native peoples east of the Mississippi River looked grim. Jackson was a war hero known for brutal campaigns against the Creek and Seminole during earlier military expeditions. He saw Native American sovereignty as incompatible with American progress and viewed natives not as citizens to be integrated, but as obstacles to be removed. Jackson wasted no time. In 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act into law. On paper, it was supposed to be a voluntary exchange. Tribes would relocate west of the Mississippi in return for land, money, and government support. But in reality, it was legalized coercion. The law gave Jackson and future presidents authority to negotiate removal treaties, many signed under duress or by minority tribal factions without broad support. Congress passed the law by a razor-thin margin. Many Americans, especially in the North, opposed it, including figures like Davy Crockett and missionaries living among Native communities. But down south, the law was wildly popular. White farmers and speculators were eager to snatch up the lands of the so-called 5 civilized tribes, especially the fertile grounds of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. Georgia wasted no time. Even before the ink dried, the state asserted jurisdiction over Cherokee lands, ignoring federal treaties and Supreme Court rulings declaring such moves unconstitutional. Cherokee leaders kept fighting back, especially the fertile lands of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. Georgia didn't waste time. Even before the ink was dry, the state moved to claim Cherokee land, ignoring federal treaties and Supreme Court rulings that declared such moves unconstitutional. Cherokee leaders kept fighting back through legal channels while Jackson's administration quietly encouraged aggressive encroachment. For Jackson and his supporters, removal was seen as a humane alternative to extermination or forced assimilation. He argued it would save Native peoples by moving them out of white settlers' reach. But for the tribes, it was just disguised theft, a robbery wrapped in policy. The Indian Removal Act marked a swift slide into humanitarian disaster. It set a legal and moral precedent, justifying years of forced migration, treaty breaking, and state-sponsored violence. Under Jackson's leadership, removal wasn't some maybe option. It was a promise, a campaign pledge, and it was about to become real. By passing the Indian Removal Act, Jackson turned the American idea of manifest destiny into federal law. And for thousands of Native families, that law meant leaving their homes, death marches, and the collapse of ancestral lands that had stood for centuries. Facing mounting pressure to give up their land, Native tribes reacted in different, often divided ways. Some fought back through legal and diplomatic channels. Others, overwhelmed by the inevitability of removal and threats of violence, reluctantly agreed to negotiate, even though they didn't trust the deal. And inside many tribes, fierce internal splits grew between those who wanted resistance and those who pushed compliance. The Cherokee Nation, in particular, became the poster child for this internal struggle, led by Chief John Ross. Most Cherokees stubbornly opposed removal. Ross was educated, politically savvy, and tirelessly defended Cherokee sovereignty. He lobbied Congress, appealed to American sympathy and took the fight all the way to the Supreme Court in Worcester, Georgia, which ruled in favor of the Cherokees. But that win was basically meaningless. Andrew Jackson and Georgia ignored the ruling, and the federal army refused to enforce it. Meanwhile, a smaller Cherokee faction led by Colonel Ridge, his son, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot decided removal was unavoidable, fearing total annihilation if they resisted. They signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835 without the majority of the tribe's consent. This treaty handed over all Cherokee lands east of the Mississippi in exchange for territory in Indian Territory and financial compensation for the U.S. government. It was the legal fig leaf they needed. For the Cherokees, it was easily a betrayal. The Treaty of New Echota barely passed the U.S. Senate by one vote, despite widespread opposition. John Ross submitted a petition with over 15,000 Cherokee signatures, almost the entire population protesting the treaty, but it was ignored. The government got what it wanted, a signature on a treaty, no matter how illegal. Similar stories played out with the Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole. Tribal leadership was fractured. Treaties were signed under duress or by unauthorized reps. Communities were split between those hoping to survive through compromise and those opposing it at all costs. By the mid-1830s, the machinery of removal was in full gear. What once was debated in Congress and courts was now reality. And for many tribes, resistance had failed not for lack of courage, but because the weight of American expansion was just too damn heavy to stop. The first big test of the Removal Act hit the Cherokee Nation. In 1830, the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek was signed, another so-called agreement made under massive pressure and government sponsorship. It handed over more than 11 million acres of Choctaw land to the U.S. in exchange for territory in what's now southeast Oklahoma. The treaty promised money, supplies, and removal support, but the reality was a whole different story. In 1831, the Choctaw Journey began their forced migration. It quickly turned into a humanitarian disaster. There were barely any wagons, food was scarce, and medical help was practically non-existent. The trek, hundreds of miles through swamps, freezing weather, and harsh terrain, was ravaged by disease, and there were barely any wagons, food was scarce, and medical help was almost non-existent. The journey, hundreds of miles through swamps, freezing cold, and rough terrain, was ravaged by disease and starvation. A Choctaw chief called it the Trail of Tears and Death, a phrase that would come to sum up the suffering of all who followed. The government's incompetence and indifference were staggering. What later defined the misery of everyone on the trail was the government's staggering incompetence and indifference. Contractors hired to transport and feed the Choctaw often didn't deliver, leaving families stranded or dying along the way. Heavy rain turned roads into unbearable mud, and many died from pneumonia, descent, or exposure. It's estimated over 2,500 Choctaw died during or right after the trek, about 20% of those forced to move. Next up were the Creek Nation. They fought tooth and nail against relocation, but many only got dragged west after getting crushed hard. In 1832, under intense pressure, the Creek signed the Yasapo Treaty of Cuseta, planting the seeds for losing their remaining lands in Alabama. Although the treaty let Creek members apply for individual land parcels, rampant fraud and settler violence made those protections laughably useless. Local white settlers invaded Creek territory, burned houses, attacked families, and stole property by force. By 1836, things boiled over into open conflict. The U.S. Army stepped in, rounding up thousands of Creek at gunpoint. Nearly $15,000 were forced to march west to Indian Territory. The conditions, basically the same nightmare. The Choctaw faced no infrastructure, crappy supplies, and a deadly winter. Thousands died en route, many buried in nameless graves along the trail. The removals of the Choctaw and Creek sent a chilling message to other tribes: resist and suffer. Treaties ignored. Survival means misery for the U.S. government. These campaigns were successes. For Native Americans, they were disasters, marking one of the darkest chapters in American history. Of all these forced removals, none is remembered or mourned more than the Cherokee removal. Unlike many tribes, the Cherokee tried really hard to fit into American society. They adopted a written constitution, developed a syllabary for their language thanks to Sequoia, printed bilingual newspapers, and built schools, farms, even plantations. Their government mirrored the U.S. system, and many hoped assimilation would secure their right to stay on their ancestral lands. Spoiler, it didn't. Despite a Supreme Court ruling in Worcester v. Georgia affirming their sovereignty, the federal government pushed ahead with removal plans, citing the controversial and illegal Treaty of New Echota as justification. By 1838, President Martin Van Buren's patience and the American public had run dry. The U.S. Army, under General Winfield Scott, was ordered to start forcibly removing the Cherokee. The Army rounded up over 16,000 Cherokee from their homes in Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Alabama. Families were torn apart. People were herded into stockades like cattle, often with barely any warning to pack. Many died in these makeshift prisons. Even before the journey began, the march west, over 1,000 miles, kicked off in fall 1838. The Cherokee were forced to walk, mostly on foot, often without enough shoes, clothes, or food. The government failed to provide wagons and supplies as promised, and brutal weather made things worse. First, the summer heat. Then winter snow turned the trek into hell. Whole families suffered from descent, pneumonia, and exhaustion. Leaders like Chief John Ross did their best to make the journey less deadly. They negotiated to form self-led groups for more flexibility. Still, thousands died. The most accepted estimates put the death toll between 4,000 and 5,000 Cherokee along the trail of tears, nearly a quarter of their entire population. The emotional toll was just as brutal. Communities that had lived together for generations were scattered. Sacred sites were left behind. A culture deeply rooted in their homeland was forced to resettle in strange, unfamiliar lands. The Cherokee removal became the symbol of everything the Trail of Tears stood for: empty promises, national betrayal, and the horrific cost of American expansionism. And though called a policy, it was really a forced death march, driven by greed and apathy. Unlike the Choctaw, Creek, or Cherokee, the Seminole didn't just quietly pack up and leave. Nope. Their removal was a bloody mess. It dragged on for decades and included 3 brutal wars. The Seminole were a unique bunch, a mix of various Native American groups and escaped African slaves who found refuge in Florida's swamps and Everglades. This wild mix, combined with guerrilla warfare skills and a deep knowledge of the terrain, made them tough opponents after the 1832 Treaty of Payne's Landing. The U.S. government claimed the Seminole had agreed to move, but many Seminole leaders called BS, saying the treaty was signed by a tiny unrepresentative group under false pretenses. When the U.S. Army showed up to enforce the move, resistance exploded into full-blown war. The Seminole Wars kicked off in 1835 and became one of the longest and most expensive Native American conflicts in U.S. history. Led by the charismatic and stubborn warrior Osceola, the Seminole hit hard from the shadows. They ambushed soldiers, vanished into the Everglades, and refused to surrender. Osceola himself became a symbol of fierce native resistance, bold, fearless, and unbreakable. But his story ended in classic betrayal. In 1837, Osceola was captured under a fake flag of truce during peace talks. He was imprisoned and died of illness shortly after. His capture marked a turning point, but not the end. Fighting dragged on for years. The government poured millions into the campaign, deploying tens of thousands of troops to squash the resistance. Eventually, thousands of Seminole were killed or forced to relocate to Indian Territory in Oklahoma. But some held out. A handful of Seminole families never surrendered, retreating deeper into Florida's wilderness. Their descendants still live in Florida today, proudly the only tribe that never signed an official surrender treaty. The Seminole resistance challenged the idea that native removal was inevitable or orderly. It exposed the government's brutal tactics and the stubborn resilience of a people who chose defiance over surrender, while others walked the trail of tears. The Seminole fought back hard, leaving a legacy of resistance that echoes through American history as one of the rare and powerful rebellions against erasure. By the early 1840s, most forced tribes had completed the grueling trek to Indian Territory, a huge chunk of land in what's now Oklahoma, set aside by the U.S. government as a permanent native homeland. But even after the trauma of removal, their suffering was far from over. Life in Indian Territory was harsh, alien, and full of new challenges. The land was rough, wild, and often terrible for farming. Tribes had to start from scratch, rebuilding homes, communities, schools, and governments. Some arrived in brutal winters with barely any shelter. Others faced drought, failed crops, or disease outbreaks. Supplies, tools, and promised government payments were often late, mishandled, or stolen by corrupt native agents. Famine and sickness were common in those early years. The psychological wounds ran just as deep. Tight-knit communities that had lived for generations in villages were scattered. Sacred grounds, rivers, and burial sites were left behind. Entire cultures were uprooted and forced to adapt under constant federal watch, but resilience persisted. The Cherokee rebuilt their government and schools. The Choctaw drafted a constitution. The Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole worked hard to preserve their traditions while adapting to a landscape that wasn't made for them. These efforts were acts of defiance, proving cultural destruction wasn't a done deal. Rebuilding the school system, the Choctaw drafted a constitution. The Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole fought too, preserved their traditions while adapting to a landscape that was never meant for them. These efforts were acts of defiance, proving cultural destruction failed. Still, tension simmered beneath the surface. Divisions, caused by forced treaties, especially among the Cherokee, lingered on. Treaty supporters like Major Ridge and Elias Boudinot were assassinated by fellow Cherokees who saw them as traitors. Hatred deepened, and rival factions shattered tribal unity. Worse, native lands were never truly safe. Whites, settlers, and land speculators kept pushing the borders, hungry for more territory. The federal government started renegotiating new treaties, demanding more land cessions, and opening doors for railroads, missionaries, and commerce. The so-called permanent native frontier turned out to be no peaceful homeland for tribes. Instead, it became just another painful chapter in a long saga of broken promises. Tribes were pushed westward to make way for America. But even there, they were still in the way. The Trail of Tears didn't just move thousands, it reshaped the soul of a nation. For surviving native tribes, it marked the start of a long exile. They lost not only their homelands, but the promises, rights, and recognition they were supposed to get. For the U.S., it became a symbol, sometimes proudly, sometimes shamefully, of sacrificing justice to expand territory. Betrayal wasn't a one-time thing. It was systemic. Treaties were signed and broken at an astounding rate. The Indian Removal Act promised a permanent promised land, yet, within decades, even that land was snatched away. By the late 19th century, the Dawes Act sliced tribal lands into individual plots, opening more territory for white settlers and further weakening community sovereignty. The loss wasn't just physical, it was cultural, spiritual, and generational. Oral traditions were cut off, languages threatened, and traditional governance eroded. Yet, despite all this damage, indigenous identity survived. Forced removal became a tragic marker, but also a rallying cry for resistance, remembrance, and eventual revival. In the broader American consciousness, the Trail of Tears was long ignored or sugar-coated in textbooks and public memory. It was often painted as a sad but necessary step in building a great nation. Only by the late 20th century did public awareness start to grow. Monuments were erected, historic routes marked, and official apologies issued. In 1987, the U.S. Congress designated the Trail of Tears National Historic Trail, acknowledging the suffering experienced by the Cherokee and other tribes. But no monument can undo what was lost. The pain of generations echoes in the names of those who fell along the trail, in the stolen futures of whole communities. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole were not defeated. They were betrayed. Their survival wasn't thanks to America's mercy, but their own endurance. The Trail of Tears isn't ancient history. Its aftermath shapes Native lives today in battles over land, sovereignty, education, and justice. The legacy of betrayal remains, but so does the determination of those who walked it. They endured more than removal. They endured erasure, and they still remember. They are still here today. The Trail of Tears is both a historical scar and a symbol of unbreakable resilience. It's remembered not just for its cruelty, but for the strength of those who survived and the generations who carry that legacy forward. Across the U.S., efforts to preserve the memory of this forced removal are growing, though its full weight still isn't fully recognized. In communities across Oklahoma and the Southeast, annual memorial events, educational programs, and reenactments honor those who were displaced or survivors and generations that carried on that legacy. Across the U.S., efforts to preserve the memory. The resentment over this forced relocation has been growing, even though its full weight still hasn't been fully acknowledged. Across communities in Oklahoma and the Southeast, annual memorial events, educational programs, and reenactments honor those who were displaced or died. The National Historic Trail of Tears stretches thousands of miles through several states, with info centers, memorials, and preserved paths marking the route. But as solemn as plaques and statues can be, they're no substitute for justice or real healing. For indigenous communities, remembrance isn't passive, it's cultural survival. Tribal nations like the Cherokee and Choctaw have developed strong programs to teach their history, revive their languages, and reconnect with traditions nearly lost. During and after forced removal, storytelling, singing, and rituals play a huge role in passing on these experiences, making sure the Trail of Tears isn't just some forgotten policy. It's remembered as a living trauma and ongoing resistance. But reckoning also means facing the bigger American memory. For years, textbooks sugar-coated the events, painting removal as a regrettable but necessary step. Only recently has the story shifted toward the real deal. Schools, museums, and public institutions are increasingly challenged to tell the full story about greed dressed up as law. Democracy, corrupted by conquest, and indigenous peoples abandoned right on their own land. This reckoning echoes in today's political battles over land rights, tribal sovereignty, environmental protection, and access to healthcare and education. The fallout of forced removal still ripples through systemic inequality, but that's also the strength that carried nations through the darkest miles of the 1830s. Remembering the Trail of Tears isn't just about looking back. It's about recognizing indigenous peoples' vibrant presence in America today. It's about honoring survival, demanding justice, and refusing to let history be rewritten to soothe the powerful. In that sense, every act of remembrance is a step on the long road home. In ancient Babylon, justice wasn't just handed down by kings. It was carved in stone for everyone to see. Around 1754 BC, King Hammurabi erected a towering stone stele inscribed with one of humanity's earliest and most influential legal codes, the Code of Hammurabi, over 7 feet tall and written in cuneiform. This black stone monument was all about showing order and power. It didn't just govern, it warned. The Code of Hammurabi included 282 laws covering everything from trade and family matters to theft and assault. But don't get your hopes up for democracy. These laws reflect a rigidly hierarchical society where punishments varied wildly depending on your social rank. For example, if a noble broke another noble's bone, the punishment was breaking their own bone classic eye for an eye stuff. But if that same noble broke a commoner's or slave's bone, the penalty was just a fine. Justice here wasn't just about the crime. It was about who you were in the pecking order. This law code emphasized personal responsibility and state authority. Builders who cut corners and caused a house collapse, killing residents, could be executed. Fraudulent merchants might get their hands chopped off. Even family disputes were tightly controlled with strict rules on marriage, inheritance, and custody. Adultery, theft, and slander were severely punished, often by execution or public shaming. What made this code revolutionary wasn't just the content, but also its visibility. The stele was placed in public, carved with an image of Hammurabi receiving divine power from Shamash, the sun god and god of justice. This wasn't just a legal text, it was propaganda reinforcing the idea that Hammurabi ruled by divine right and that his laws were sacred and unchangeable, brutal by today's standards. The Code of Hammurabi established the concept that laws should be written down, standardized, and understandable. It replaced random judgment with codified standards. By doing so, it laid the groundwork for later legal systems across the ancient world and continues to fascinate historians, lawyers, and ethicists in modern standards. Hammurabi's code laid down the idea that laws should be written down, standardized, and clear. It replaced arbitrary judgment with codified rules. In doing so, it laid the groundwork for legal systems across the ancient world and still fascinates historians, lawyers, and ethicists today in Babylon. Justice wasn't blind. It was watching you with a chisel in hand. In ancient Egypt, justice wasn't just a legal concept. It was a cosmic force. Egyptians believed in Maat, a sacred principle embodying truth, balance, and moral order. More than a goddess, Maat was the foundation of the universe. Pharaohs ruled not just by power, but by the duty to uphold Maat. That's how they kept harmony going, peace between gods, nature, and society. Unlike Babylon's rigid laws, Egyptian justice was way more flexible and case by case. No single law code was chiseled in stone. Instead, judges, usually high officials or priests, interpreted Maat in their rulings. This meant decisions fit the situation, but also that justice could get pretty subjective and heavily depend on social status. Court procedures were equal parts formality and show. Cases could be heard by local officials or higher royal bureaucracy courts depending on how serious the crime was. Plaintiffs and defendants laid out their versions of events, and witnesses were a must. Records, contracts, testimonies, and petitions were all kept on. Papyrus, a pretty advanced filing system for the time. For everyday crimes, like theft or assault, punishments could include fines, beatings, or forced labor. More serious crimes like tomb robbery or blasphemy weren't just offenses against the state. They were sins against the gods. Punishments sometimes meant being burned alive, drowned, impaled, or even death sentences, like desecrating corpses to stop souls from crossing over. Probably the most iconic image of Egyptian justice comes from the Book of the Dead, where the deceased's heart is weighed against Maat's feather. If the heart was heavy with guilt, it got devoured by Amet, a monster mashup of crocodile, lion, and hippo, condemning the soul to oblivion. If balanced with the feather, the soul earned eternal paradise in the reed fields. In Egypt, justice wasn't just legal, it was spiritual. The courtroom wasn't just where disputes got settled, it was a sacred space where divine order was maintained. Unlike Babylon's stiff laws, Egyptian justice flowed with Maat's moral vibes, rewarding those who lived in harmony with truth and punishing those who messed with the cosmic balance. In ancient Greece, especially Athens in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, justice looked completely different from the god-centered or king-centered systems of Babylon and Egypt. The Greeks started fiddling with something revolutionary, a justice system based on citizen rights, debate, and public involvement. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it laid the groundwork for many modern legal ideas. Athenian democracy handed every male citizen the right to participate in court as plaintiff, defendant, or juror. No, professional judges or lawyers. Instead, a huge jury, sometimes hundreds strong, was randomly picked from the public. These jurors didn't just hear cases, they decided verdicts and punishments, with no appeals allowed. Trials were quick, often wrapped up in one day, and each side got a set amount of time to make their case, timed by a water clock called a clepsydra. Cases ranged from theft, slander, adultery, assault, property disputes. Even disrespecting the gods could get you hauled in. Minor crimes usually got fines or exile, but serious ones could mean death, especially in treason or religious blasphemy cases. For example, Socrates was sentenced to death for allegedly corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods. The key here is that Greek justice wasn't based on a written code everyone could read. While some laws were publicly known, most legal knowledge was held by a small literate elite, meaning outcomes often depended. The Greek justice system didn't rely on a publicly accessible written code, while some laws were announced openly. Most legal knowledge was held by a small elite of literate folks, meaning outcomes often depended more on slick talk than precedent. A clever speaker or rich citizen could hire a talented orator to argue for them, giving them a serious edge. Justice was tightly bound to persuasion and performance. Athenians also used a preventive justice tool called ostracism, where citizens could vote once a year to exile someone from the city for 10 years. No crime had to be proven, just a consensus that someone had gotten a bit dangerous or too powerful for the state's safety. Flawed as it was, ancient Greece tossed out the idea that justice could be a collective citizen responsibility, not just some dictator's or priest's whim. An early, chaotic experiment in legal equality that still echoes in courtrooms today. Over in ancient India, justice came from a deep, layered concept called dharma. A tough word to translate, but roughly it means duty, integrity, and cosmic order. Unlike Babylon's rules or Greek civil courts, Indian justice wasn't just about right and wrong. It was about keeping harmony in the universe, society, and yourself. Laws changed depending on age, class, gender, and life stage, making justice a super-contextual and deeply moral affair. Ancient India's legal framework was first formalized in texts called Dharma Shastras, the most famous being Manusmriti, or the Laws of Manu. Compiled roughly between the 2nd century BCE and 3rd century CE, these texts weren't laws like we think of today, but spiritual and social guides that shaped legal thinking. For centuries, they covered everything from property rights and inheritance to marriage contracts and punishments. The caste system was front and center in this legal vision. Brahmins, the priests, kshatriyas, the warriors, vaishyas, the merchants, and sudras, the workers, all had different rules and punishments. For example, a Brahmin committing a crime might get fined or temporarily banned from rituals, while a Sudra committing the same crime could face corporal punishment or worse. Justice in this system was anything but blind. It was hierarchical, tied tightly to where you were born. Still, Indian justice wasn't completely unforgiving. Intent mattered a lot, as did remorse. Offenders could lighten their sentences by repenting or donating to charity. And judges were encouraged to consider the moral and spiritual state of the accused. Kings often acted as the highest court, advised by scholars and Brahmin ministers, blending divine law with royal edicts. Trials could involve oral hearings, especially when evidence was sketchy. These included walking on hot iron rods, passing through fire, or grabbing items from boiling oil, believed to reveal guilt or innocence by divine will. Such methods were last resorts, not your everyday courtroom routine. Above all, ancient Indian justice aimed to restore cosmic balance, not just punish crime. It was about wiping out spiritual mistakes, fixing social chaos, and guiding souls back to righteousness. A legal system where ethics, religion, and law were glued together. Across the ancient world, when legal systems hit a wall, lack of evidence, unreliable witnesses, or unprovable accusations, society often turned to the gods for the final say. One of the scariest and most dramatic ways to do this was through brutal ordeals. Used in cultures from Babylon to India and later medieval Europe, the idea was simple but savage. If human justice couldn't nail the culprit, divine justice would step in with pain. In Babylon, a common torture was dunking the accused in a river if they floated or survived. The gods had mercy, and they were declared innocent. If they drowned, guilt was confirmed. Though inconveniently, the dead couldn't be punished anymore. This method reflected a deep belief in divine oversight, since water was seen as a sacred, fair force. In ancient India, as outlined in this method, reflects a deep belief in divine oversight, since water was seen as a sacred and fair force. In ancient India, as outlined in the Dharma scriptures, there were various kinds of ordeals. These included walking on hot iron plows, picking up coins from boiling oil, or surviving poison exposure. The logic wasn't cruelty. It was divine judgment. Surviving with no or minor injuries was proof of innocence. People believed the gods wouldn't let the innocent suffer without a reason. Horrifying by modern standards. But the ordeal wasn't always just physical. Sometimes it involved swearing oaths at sacred places, swearing on holy objects, or invoking a god's wrath was supposed to bind the speaker to the truth. Lying under such conditions was believed to bring immediate or afterlife divine punishment. The psychological power of these ordeals was massive. They could scare the guilty into confessing and reinforce believers' faith in cosmic justice. But they also reveal how fragile human legal systems are. Ancient people felt deeply the need for something beyond human judgment. Oral trials were often a last resort, a way to settle cases no one else could. Despite relying on supernatural results, oral debates reflected a desire for fairness. Sure, they were brutal, but also strangely democratic. Both kings and peasants could face their rulings. Without forensics or legal procedures, suffering became the courtroom, and gods were expected to act as judge, jury, and executioner. In ancient Egypt, justice wasn't enforced by fair courts or elected juries. It came straight from the divine power of the pharaoh. As king and living god, Pharaoh was seen as the earthly embodiment of Ma'at, the principle of truth, balance, and cosmic order. That meant upholding justice wasn't just about It's just political duty, a sacred obligation. Pharaoh had ultimate legal power. His word could overturn any verdict, order executions, pardon the guilty, or rewrite laws on a whim. This imaisinus concentration of power wasn't justified by human logic, but by divine approval. Ignoring Pharaoh's orders would mess up the cosmic harmony. But Pharaoh didn't rule solo. There was a massive bureaucracy stretching all across Egypt. From royal officials in the capital to local judges in provincial towns, these folks acted as judges, clerks, and investigators. Their decisions followed royal decrees and Ma'at principles rather than any formal legal code. Written laws were rare and mostly based on cases, passed down through precedent and scribal training. Courtrooms came in all shapes and sizes, in tiny villages. Disputes might be settled by a council of elders or priests at the temple. In big cities, official courts handled complicated cases about property, theft, assault, and inheritance. Everything was painstakingly recorded on papyrus scrolls, many of which survive today, giving us a rare glimpse into how ancient Egyptians argued and judged. Trials included witness testimony and written evidence. Plaintiffs and defendants gave sworn statements. Witnesses were summoned. And physical evidence, when available, was reviewed. False accusations were punished harshly, if proven. The accuser could face the same punishment as the accused. Penalties ranged from fines and compensation to whipping, forced labor, or execution, crimes against temples, tombs, or royal property got extra harsh treatment. But the system also stressed restoration and compensation. Offenders often got the chance to make amends, especially if they confessed voluntarily. What makes Egyptian justice unique is the easy mix of autocratic monarchy and moral expectation. Pharaoh could rule with unchecked power, but he was expected to wield it fairly. In the eyes of people and gods, a just ruler was not only feared, but revered as the guardian of cosmic balance. While divine kings and priests dominated justice in many ancient civilizations, ancient Greece, especially democratic Athens, took a totally different route. Justice was no longer an exclusive domain of gods and kings. It became a public duty, shared and carried out by the people through councils and assemblies. In Athens, judicial power was mainly in two bodies: Ecclesia, the citizen assembly, and Helia, a massive people's court made up of citizen jurors. Instead of laws handed down by rulers, laws and justice were shaped by ordinary male citizens who took turns managing affairs. Laws were proposed and voted on by the assembly, while trials were run by large juries, sometimes 500 or more. To prevent bribery or manipulation, no judges like we know them today. Instead, judges chosen by lot or popular vote ran the trials and ensured procedures were followed. But the real decision makers were the randomly selected jurors aged over 30. No appeals process, no cooling off period. Verdicts were final, and punishments voted on right after guilt was confirmed. The system favored persuasive speech over hard evidence. Defendants and plaintiffs had to represent themselves or hire expert orators to craft speeches for them. Rhetoric was everything, and skillfully tugging public emotion could change the outcome. While this system boosted citizen participation, it also meant justice could be uneven. Less about law and more about persuasion. For some political issues or state threats, special councils were convened. One famous method was ostracism, where citizens voted once a year to exile anyone deemed dangerous to the state. Democracy, no crime needed, just public agreement that someone's influence is toxic. 10 years of exile, no trial, no defense, despite its flaws. The Greek council system threw out some bold new ideas: the importance of peer review, open debate, and the idea that laws belong to the people. Messy, emotional, and sometimes unfair, but revolutionary nonetheless. In Greek courts, the courtroom was a stage. Citizens were judges, and justice was a public show, a system where everyone had a role and power was held by the people for a brief moment. In ancient India, justice wasn't just courts and punishment. It was tied to karma, the belief that every action has moral weight and spiritual consequences in this life and the next. Unlike Greek civil trials or Egyptian royal decrees, India's justice system focused on the cosmic ledger, where no misdeed escaped. Ultimate accountability. Karma isn't legal mechanics. It's a moral law linked to Hindu and Buddhist traditions. Good deeds bring good results. Bad deeds bring suffering, though not always right away. A thief might dodge human justice, but the universe always balances the books. This belief kept people behaving even when there was no enforcement. Still, ancient India had a structured legal system. Manusmriti and other law texts guided courts and personal behavior. They spelled out duties for each caste and social role, making it clear justice isn't one size fits all. Kings were expected to rule by these doctrines, and failure could bring spiritual and political fallout. Buddhism, emerging in the 5th century BCE, deepened the karma angle in justice. It rejected legal inequality based on caste and pushed for universal ethics, nonviolence, honesty, and compassion. Not a law code, but Buddhist ethics influenced rulers like Emperor Ashoka in the 3rd century BCE, who gave up conquest and reformed his empire on Buddhist values. His famous rock edicts preached mercy, tolerance, and the moral duty of rulers. Justice back then wasn't just judging and punishing. It was about inner purity, intention, and spiritual responsibility. You might dodge the king's punishment, but not the fallout from your own actions. Similarly, an unjust king was believed to pile up suffering for himself in future lives. This understanding of karma and justice created a powerful inner order. For many, it was deeply personal and scarier than any earthly authority. Whether enforced by law or left to the universe, Indian civilization saw justice not just as punishment, but as restoring harmony between self, society, and the cosmos. Thousands of years after Babylon, Egypt, Greece, and India rose. Their justice systems still shape how we think about crime, punishment, and fairness today. These ancient civilizations laid the intellectual, ethical, and procedural groundwork for legal systems running the world now. Babylon gave us the earliest codified laws, the idea that justice must be public, consistent, and enforced by the state. The eye for an eye principle still pops up in legal and ethical debates, symbolizing calls for proportional punishment and the dangers of going overboard. Egypt introduced the idea of divine kingship and moral law, where justice was not only social, but cosmic. The The focus on balance, truth, and harmony echoes in modern restorative justice, aiming not just to punish, but to restore community balance. The focus on balance, truth, and harmony shines through in modern ideas of restorative justice, where the goal isn't just punishment, but restoring community balance. Greece revolutionized justice by tying it to citizenship and participation, jury trials, public debates, and peer judgment started in Athens and remain central to many legal systems today. Though imperfect and exclusive, Greek democracy planted the seeds for legal systems really care about public involvement and accountability. India made a deep mark on this. Justice, the ideas of dharma and karma added an ethical backbone to legal frameworks, pushing for personal responsibility and self-regulation. Even today, Indian law is a quirky mix where British legal structures coexist with religious and customary laws, showing off some serious ancient staying power. These systems, far from perfect, they could be unjust, classist, patriarchal, and downright brutal. They favored the elites, punished the weak, and enforced rigid hierarchies. But they also threw out some big questions that still matter today. Who gets to define justice? Is it divine authority, citizen consensus, or moral truth? Should the law treat everyone equally or bend to social roles? How do you balance punishment with mercy? Modern laws might be more humane and structured, but deep down, they still carry the DNA of these ancient systems. We're still carving laws in stone, metaphorically hoping they'll keep order. It's more structured now, sure, but it still carries the DNA of those original systems. We still carve laws into stone, figuratively speaking, and expect them to keep order. We still argue about justice in courts, councils, and temples of thought, and we're still wrestling with the eternal tension between power and fairness, law and morality, crime and consequence. In many ways, our chase after justice is as old as time, and it's far from over.